Mr Speaker.
I call Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak on this bill and support the comments by my colleagues Meka Whaitiri and David Parker and William Seal. And local government's always an issue that we like to talk about in this House, because it's very interesting to think about what a troubled relationship this national government has had with local government in the last 8 years. And I think it's important to consider the backdrop to this bill, which is the very vexed history of policy that this government has had in regards to local government, starting with the forced amalgamation of Auckland. They took a good idea and made a hash of it, legislating away the right of Aucklanders to have a say, to exercise their democratic rights that are enshrined in law for all citizens in regards to local government amalgamations. It wasn't very long that they'd been in office before they basically closed down democracy for Environment Canterbury, for the Canterbury Regional Council, so that their corporate dairy farmer mates could basically pillage the water resources in Canterbury. And National was quite happy to shut down democracy in Canterbury and still hasn't restored it properly. Next thing they did was they stripped the four well-beings out of the Local Government Act, basically, and narrowed the focus of local government considerably against the wishes, I think, of most communities around New Zealand. They made it easier for councils to privatise municipal water utilities. And then, really, over the last 2 or 3 years, we saw this, this kind of comedy of errors as successive local government ministers pursued this process of this policy of forced amalgamations. Well, what a resounding success that was, Mr Speaker. It was given short shrift in Northland, in Wellington and Hawke's Bay. It was a total disaster. So to hear Scott Simpson, the chair of the Local Government and Environment Committee, stand up and say this government's policy is not to have forced amalgamations, completely oblivious to the fact that that has been their policy for the last 3 years. And this bill that comes to the House today, which aims to facilitate the development of shared CCOs and shared arrangements between councils, and makes a few relatively subtle tweaks to the processes and the rules around amalgamations and the powers of the Local Government Commission. This bill and the so-called Better Local Government Services policy package is a direct response to the abject failure of the National Party's local government policy, which was all about forced amalgamations, and it was comprehensively rejected, sir. So it has been a very troubled relationship that National's had with local government. The other thing that characterises their policy has been the persistent scapegoating of local government for every imagined ill. And the one that we've heard most about in recent times is the Auckland housing crisis, which if you listen to what the National Party says about the housing crisis, the main thing that they like to do is to blame the RMA and blame Auckland Council for the failure of their own policy. And the rather kind of pathetic whimper that we were greeted with a couple of weeks ago when they released their national policy statement that they promised 8 years ago in a campaign manifesto. It's taken them 8 years to deliver on that promise. They came up with a national policy statement that I know Paul Goldsmith, who fancies himself as some kind of libertarian, must be cringingly embarrassed to be associated with a national policy statement that does nothing to improve or to fix the restrictive land use rules that are a significant factor in driving up land prices and house prices in Auckland. So that is the rather desperate and parlous state of the National Party's local government policy, sir. What they've done with this bill that we're debating tonight in the first reading is bring together a package of measures that are designed to encourage councils. If we're not going to go down the forced amalgamation route, perhaps we can encourage councils to set up some shared assets. So what this bill wants to do is to facilitate and make it easier for the establishment of multiply owned council-controlled organisations. For example, for setting up jointly owned a transport organisation or a jointly owned water authority. We have direct experience of this already, sir, and as David Parker pointed out, the national government imposed on Auckland a legislated transport CCO. They won't allow, it's in the legislation. Auckland Council, if it wants to bring the transport agency in-house, it can't, because it's legislated in the Auckland Super City founding legislation, and also set up water care. Now, I think on the face of it, you'd have to say that there is some logic to the idea of regionally or multiply owned CCOs for these purposes, and there is a proposal that's circulating that's been discussed in the Waikato, and the Council for Infrastructure Development released a report recently that projected that if the Waipa, Waikato and Hamilton councils created a joint water utility, they could save $500 million over the next 30 years and $107 million over the next decade. Well, if that's true, those are pretty impressive savings. And you'd have to look at the experience of water care in Auckland. And while many Aucklanders will complain that their water rates haven't gone down and in some cases have gone up, the establishment of a publicly owned, non-profit water utility has probably delivered some significant efficiencies in Auckland and allowed the creation of an organisation that has the balance sheet, the professional skills and specialisation to properly manage the asset management of billions of dollars worth of wastewater and drinking water infrastructure for 1/3 of the country's population. And there's no doubt that many of the smaller and dispersed local authorities around the country have really struggled to deliver, to meet the clean water standards, to invest in the plant and the technology that's necessary to deliver the environmental protection and the water quality standards that everybody in this country deserves. And probably the textbook case of a small rural council that failed in this duty was the Kaipara District Council, who got into a terrible mess in borrowing a whole lot of money for a water treatment plant at Mangawhai, and I think we all don't want to see that sort of stuff continue. Previous speakers have pointed out that in many areas around the country, local councils are already doing a very good job of cooperating, and I want to pay tribute to the councils in the Bay of Plenty, the local government, the Bay of Plenty Local Government Futures Project, who have a track record both through that initiative, but also through smart growth, which has been going on for the best part of a decade, including Tauranga and Western Bay of Plenty councils and others, doing some really fantastic work in that area, managing land supply, infrastructure, land for both business and residential. And it's a very, very impressive example of regional cooperation by local territorial authorities. So this bill hasn't invented the idea of shared services and shared assets, but it is something that is worth considering. I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the proposed proposals to reorganisation procedures and register our concern that what this bill does is removes the ability of local ratepayers to petition their local authority for a poll on any amalgamation or reorganisation changes. So we do not support that, and we will be arguing very strongly at Select Committee and scrutinising those proposals. We do not support the removal of a poll of electors for any so-called council-led proposals on reorganisation, even where all of the affected local authorities agree, because local people and local ratepayers deserve and demand a say in the structures of representation and decision-making in their communities. That is fundamental, sir. So we have real concerns that this bill should not be used as a backdoor attempt to pursue the same old National Party agenda of forced amalgamation. We support this bill going to Select Committee, but we will be very closely scrutinising it.
E te mana whakaua.